The session here is advancements in private clouds, right? So as most of you guys in here must be aware, 2 to 3 years ago, we had the big advent of software-defined networking, right? And one of the primary goals for that were around network virtualization, were around overlays. And if you look at it, the primary use case which it's enabling now is security and microsegmentation, right? So either with Cisco ACI or VMware NSX or NewArch or OpenStack, a lot of these deployments which are leveraging SDN are actually using security as a primary driver for SDN, right? So having said that, we will look at, so we've been in this space for a couple of years now. We are actually now adding the next generation features in a lot of our integrations to enable security in your SDN environments. So in this session, we'll primarily cover the new hypervisors that we are supporting. We'll go over some of the SDN integrations and the features that we're bringing in each one of them. And we'll look at some of the generic functionality that we're bringing in 7.1, which covers both private clouds and public clouds. So that's how we'll structure the next 40 to 45 minutes. So I'm Sudeep Padiyar. I'm the Senior Product Manager at Palo Alto Networks. I've been here close to 18 months now, and I primarily focus on security in the private cloud environments. So let's jump right in. So in terms of agenda, we'll start off with some of the challenges in the SDDC or the software-defined data center security and how we address them here at Palo Alto Networks. We'll then look into some of the new hypervisor support, like I said. We'll spend a lot more time on our VMware NSX integration because that's one of our primary integrations in the SDN space. And we'll go into some of the new functionality that we're bringing in to enable a totally new set of use cases in this area. We'll also touch upon Cisco ACI. That's the other SDN vendor, if you will, wherein we have an integration with them. We'll try to touch upon that, and then we'll go through the generic functionality, like I said. So let's start off with the key requirements for software-defined data center security, right? So the primary one is essentially around zero trust. Different vendors call it different things. As from the VMware context, you will see the term microsegmentation. We call it zero trust. They're all along the same lines. Where essentially now in a virtualized environment, when you're spinning up different applications in different tiers, you have the additional controls for allowing and disallowing traffic between these different tiers of your applications. Right, a typical example would be the web app DB tiers, and as you're rolling them out with microsegmentation and zero trust, you now have innate capabilities in your infrastructure layer to allow controlled communication between the servers in these tiers, right? So we'll touch upon that. The next key aspect is around advanced threat prevention and protection, and we've been focusing a lot, if you've attending the keynotes, we've been talking a lot about our threat capabilities as well as how we look at protection and prevention. And especially in the SDDC context, it becomes very relevant as you are protecting your application and you're protecting your different tier traffic with Content ID, with Wildfire, and all the advanced threat capabilities that we have in our products. You can actually now prevent lateral propagation of threats in your data center. And we actually have a demo for that. The next two elements, I'm sure you guys are familiar with, is around network agility, because with the server virtualization, you could see that the rollouts for application on the compute side has been way quicker and faster than how you provision your networks. And now with SDDC, you have virtualization on the network side as well, which allows you to transparently insert security. And that has actually enabled rollout of applications both from the compute side and the network and security side. And you will see in our NSX integration how that is done. So next, let's look at the clouds that we are supporting, right? So on the private cloud arena, obviously we started off with VMware ESX. NSX is the primary integration, as I said, and KVM and OpenStack, right? So these are all the platforms that we support today. Now with 7.1, as you guys must have heard in the keynote yesterday, we are supporting the Microsoft environments. So we are supporting Azure and the public cloud, and in the private cloud, we are now supporting Hyper-V. So the way to look at the Hyper-V support is going to be more along the lines of what we've done with ESXi. So you essentially have a VMSeries running on the Hyper-V hosts, which can protect all the traffic going on the single host as well as across hosts, right? So you have the different capabilities on the switching infrastructure on Hyper-V for the internal and external networks, which actually allow you to insert a firewall using layer 2 and layer 3 to protect all the traffic going between the VMs on a single or on multiple Hyper-V hosts. And in that scenario, you can have your VMSeries firewall as an L3 gateway for segmenting all the traffic going in and out of the hosts, as well as for other use cases such as IPsec termination. So you have all the capabilities now to roll out a VMSeries firewall on the Hyper-V platform. So let's zoom into some of the nuances in that area. So the platforms that we are supporting is essentially the Hyper-V Server 2012, both in the standalone and headless mode, as well as the Windows Server 2012 R2 in Hyper-V role, right? So these are, both those options are available for you with Hyper-V. And the second key support that we're adding with Hyper-V is around visibility into the VMSeries firewall when it's deployed in this environment. So Hyper-V and SCVM have this capability called Linux Integration Services, which essentially allows you to provide visibility or information about your VMSeries, which includes things like management IP addresses, the resource utilization, heartbeat mechanisms going with SCVM, as well as taking HA actions if there is a heartbeat miss or any of these. So all of these capabilities will be available with the Linux Integration Services. The rest of the capabilities, like I said, are similar, so you can deploy the VMSeries on Hyper-V in layer 2, layer 3, or tap mode. And as you guys are aware, tap mode is more common, where we see customers deploy the VMSeries on the hypervisor in tap mode, get visibility into the different traffic patterns on a particular host, and then turn on security, right? So all of those modes are available. And in terms of high availability, you can have multiple VMSeries on a same host or across hosts, and the HA1, HA2, HA3 for config sync, for session sync that we have both on our physical platforms as well as on the other VMSeries platforms are going to be available on Hyper-V as well. So that's the key functionality that is being rolled out on the Hyper-V platform. So next, let's actually jump in to the VMSeries NSX integration and the new capabilities that we're bringing in NSX, and we'll also talk about and actually go through some of the demos so that you guys know operationally how each of these new features work. So just to level set, today obviously, the key features of the VMware NSX integration has been around the fact that as you roll out your NSX infrastructure and you actually bring up all these different tiers in your ESXi environment, what you have a capability to do now is actually insert the VMSeries automatically between the different security groups or different tiers on the NSX layer, right? So what it provides you is essentially the advanced capabilities of security with app ID, user ID in certain VDI scenarios, as well as all the lateral threat propagation, which I'll talk about in more detail. But the key capabilities here have been essentially around automating both the lifecycle for the VMSeries firewall, as well as the policy management and context information actually going back and forth between the NSX environment and the firewall to make sure that they have a consistent view of security, and you don't need to update your security policies anytime there are events on the ESXi infrastructure, such as vMotion or rolling out of new hosts or adding new applications, right? So that's been the key capabilities of the NSX integration. So next, let's look at a quick demo. And in this demo, what we're going to go over is one of the recent attacks from November 2015, which was called Deja Vu. which is essentially targeting the IBM WebSphere servers, wherein by using some, the Apache common libraries was actually kind of leveraged or used to get root access into other servers in your data center environments. And then, the hackers could move laterally from server to server wherever they had Apache running. So we'll look at how we can address that with the VMSeries firewall. So we start off by actually, so I'm assuming most of you guys are familiar with the interface here. This is on the NSX manager side. So this is how the traffic redirection rules are actually set up. And what we do here is, as we start off, we disable the redirection to the Palo Alto Networks firewall to see how the infrastructure would handle these threats. So these are the rules that you have from the web tier to the app tier and the app tier to the DB tier, and that's where the Palo Alto Networks firewall is inserted. And these are the different dynamic address groups which actually map to the corresponding security groups within NSX. And in this case, we've turned on all the threat capabilities on the firewall, and as well as we allow only certain applications to go through. So this is actually in the Ixia breaking point where we turn on the tests, and all the different threat vectors are now going to pass through the different web and app tiers. And in the first test, like I was saying earlier, because there is no VMSeries firewall, you see that there's a bunch of threats which are actually infecting the VMs on the application side, right? So next, we actually go and turn on the partner redirection rules to insert the VMSeries in the path of traffic. And now if you see, the total blocked threats is increasing because the VMSeries is actually able to detect each of these threats. And if you see, I was saying earlier, the Apache common library threat is the deja vu attack that is being thwarted here by the VMSeries, right? So that's the key benefit, because as you insert your VMSeries firewalls between the different application tiers, you will automatically be allowed to block all these threats and prevent the lateral propagation in the data center. So we'll move on with the rest of the functionality. So let's start with the next capabilities that we're bringing in on the VMSeries integration. So we've been out in the field for over a year and a half now, and the different deployments that we've seen, and actually having the benefit of talking to multiple of you guys and getting more feedback, we see that the deployments are actually being rolled out with larger scale in the VMware environments, right? So obviously you have multiple applications, multiple VMs being rolled out on the different hosts. The number of hosts itself which are being protected with the VMSeries in these integrations is going higher, as well as the other scale scenarios such as multiple vCenters, multiple ESXi clusters, multiple NSX managers, right? So we're trying to address that in 7.1, and I'll go over some of that functionality. The other is around performance, right? So as most of you guys must be aware, we can do 1 Gbps for app ID with 4 core today. And again, we have best practices around that on what kind of traffic should be steered to the Palo Alto Networks firewall. But again, with the increasing deployments, the requirements for performance keeps increasing, right? So we look at how we're going to address it in the short term and the long term. And the third key deployment area is for dark networks, right? This is government, federal agencies, power plants, some MSSP environments which don't have internet connectivity on Panorama. And as most of you guys must be aware, today, because of all the automation capabilities, we actually have the licensing happening automatically on the VMSeries using Panorama. So the internet connectivity was required. And in this release, we'll look at how you can deploy these firewalls without internet connectivity. So to look at the key capabilities in 7.0 from the NSX integration, so if you had multiple ESXi clusters and multiple hosts within them, you do deploy one VMSeries per host. And the two key aspects here from the deployment side is around service profiles and service definitions on the NSX side, and the zones and vWires on the Palo Alto Networks VMSeries side. Right? So in the current deployments, you actually have one default service profile and a default zone, which are created automatically. So the user doesn't even need to create it because there's only one. And those get pushed to all the firewalls which are deployed on the NSX layer. Right? So you have a single service profile. Now the notion of service definition is essentially the mapping with the policy set, which will be pushed to the firewalls, the templates for all the network configuration, as well as the VMSeries OVF, which determines which version of software will actually run on the VMSeries as it's instantiated in this environment. And the last aspect is around the licensing itself, right? So we have bundle auth codes with NSX, which allow you to have different subscriptions. So we have two bundles, one with 2 subscriptions and the other with 5. But today, as you roll out your deployment, all of these would be identical because you would have a single service definition and a single service profile, right? So that's where we are with 7.0. So next we look at, in 7.1, how we are taking it a step forward. So if you look at multi-tenancy in virtualized environments and specifically in the VMware environments, most of our customers, especially in the enterprise IT, the IT as a service, that's where most of the NSX deployments we see are. You have an option of shared infrastructure or dedicated infrastructure, right? And most of the IT as a service obviously is running on shared infrastructure, which essentially means you will have different tenants, which are either different business units, different departments for that organization. And as they are rolling out applications, you actually roll them out on the same shared infrastructure. So this is the model that you're looking at. It is essentially shared security. So you'll have one VMSeries firewall, which will be protecting traffic going between different tenants. And we look at how we can now enable that functionality in 7.1. So that's the first model, where you have, again, the different application tiers for each of the departments, and you're protecting the traffic of the VMSeries. The second is around dedicated security, right? If your requirements for isolation, for policy, for resources, for fault isolation are higher, then in certain scenarios, you have customers actually requiring a dedicated VMSeries per tenant. All of this is on the shared infrastructure. And the third is where you're actually rolling out dedicated infrastructure per customer, right? This is more common in hosting, in MSSP environments. And in that kind of a scenario, we now have a capability to have multiple policy sets to be actually deployed on these firewalls. So you could have a different software version running per customer, different licenses. Some customers might want only threat. The others want URL filtering and wildfire. So all of those use cases can now be supported with both the multi-tenancy and multiple policy set capability that we're introducing in 7.1. So this is essentially, I'll go over the multi-tenancy over shared infrastructure in some detail now. So if you had 2 tenants, and it could be finance and marketing, or in a typical DevOps environment, it could be production, dev, and test. So you have these 2 tenants, and we look at how we are actually going to provision security for each of them. So in 7.1, you can now actually configure zones on Panorama, and they'll automatically get pushed to the relevant firewalls. And the notion of a zone, so the tenant mapping, which is the key thing to keep in mind here, is zones and a vWire pair on the VMSeries firewall maps to the service profiles on NSX Manager, right? So that's essentially the context information which is needed to determine the traffic going between different tenants so that the right policy can be applied on the VMSeries side, right? So you need that mapping. And that's how the mapping is built. And all of this, again, happens automatically, right? And we'll go over that in the demo, but you essentially create the zone, and by virtue of that, you will actually be pushing the service profiles into NSX Manager, and you will actually be pushing the zones and the VMware pairs on the VMSeries firewall. So in the past, you had only one VMware pair. Now you can have multiple VMware pairs for actually doing traffic separation for the different tenants' traffic in these multi-tenant scenarios. So in the second example, you're pushing the second zone configuration, which is again going to NSX Manager and down to the firewall. So the other key functionality that is supported with this introduction is actually being able to support duplicate IP addresses. So now that we have a notion of a zone and a service profile, we can resolve duplicate IP addresses by using a combination of the security group where that VM resides and the service profile to be able to distinguish or resolve the IP addresses on the firewall, right? So that, again, has been a key ask from a lot of our customers, because when you use templates to roll out applications, you want to do that with identical attributes, and that includes IP addresses, right? So that's a key introduction now to be able to support duplicate IP addresses. And we can now scale up to 32 tenants. So next, let's look at actually how this works on the NSX side and on the VMSeries side. So this is the Panorama UI, and the first step would actually be to create the relevant zones in the appropriate device group and template, right? So in this particular case, the template, the zone configuration is in the template. So whatever you specified in the VM Service Manager within Panorama is what you would use, and in the relevant template, you will create these zones. Not used the Windows for a while, so you have all these different clicks going on. So this is the zone configuration. In this case, the tenants are essentially production, dev, and QA, your typical DevOps environment. And for each of the tenants, you're now creating a separate zone, right? So this is the configuration that you need to be aware of, okay. Wherein within the zone configuration, you're now selecting, that's the new option which is added in 7.1, right? The NSX service profile. And once you select that, that's when the new functionality kicks in automatically with regards to pushing the policy and configuration on NSX side, right? So that's one thing to keep in mind. And the other key configuration is the dynamic address groups, right? So in this particular example, you have 3 tenants, production, dev, and QA, and you have a typical 3-tiered application for web app and DB. So the 3 times 3 becomes 9 dynamic address groups with the corresponding security groups coming from NSX, right? So those are the 9 dynamic address groups that you're creating. And again, they are in the relevant template. And this is the other key point, right? As you select the tags for in your dynamic address group configurations, you will now see all the different tenant tags, right? So those are the match criteria which you will select in your dynamic address groups, and they now include all the different tags that we just saw for web app and DB for each of the 3 tenants, right? So for production, in this case, you will pick the relevant production web tag coming from NSX, and that's how the actual mapping will happen, so that for any of the VMs which are spun up in that tier, this particular dynamic address group and the policies associated with that will kick in And again, as I was alluding to earlier, you're using the combination of service profile and security group to resolve the duplicate IP addresses. And this is the duplicate IP address, as in the web VMs, both for production and QA, have the identical IP addresses in this setup. And on the firewall side and Panorama side, this is how the configurations actually look, right? So I'll spend some time here because this is how you need to build your policies, and this is important because you essentially, in the past, because you had a single zone, the zone was irrelevant. Now you have a zone per tenant. So if you see how you're building your policies, you're building it in the context of the production zone. And this is how all the different policies using the relevant dynamic address groups will actually be created within the policy tab in Panorama, right? So you have this capability now to create separate policies for different tenants and having it in the context of the relevant zone. And each of them could then have blocking different applications. A particular tenant might say that he wants to allow only MySQL traffic for database. Another tenant might want to allow only SAP traffic or Oracle traffic. So all of that is now enabled because you have zone-based policies on the firewall. So if you see the zone for each of the policies is actually built together based on the tenant, right? So, and the same is applicable when you look at logs, when you look at filtering or the packet flow information for separate interfaces. You can now look at it per tenant on the sub-interface pair on which the traffic is actually flowing on the firewall. So that is how things look primarily on the VMseries side. On the NSX side, you essentially have the VMs, which are created again per tenant, and as you'll see here, the same mapping is seen on the NSX manager side as well, so I won't spend too much time on this, but again, the key attribute is duplicate IP addresses. And so this is the other configuration on NSX side that you need to be aware of, right? So now that you created these multiple service profiles within NSX, the way the glue actually works is when you create your steering rule on the NSX side, you need to use the relevant service profile. So for the different security groups that you created, say for web, app, and DB for production, you need to use the production service profile when you're creating the steering rule, right? So again, that's how the mapping actually happens, because when the traffic hits the VMseries, it actually has this context information, and that's how it maps to the relevant zone and the relevant VOR pair, and the relevant policies kick in, right? So do keep this in mind, and again, we'll have all the documentation for this as well as some demos available, but this is how you actually ensure that the tenant information is actually mapping in both environments. And we have a quick ping test here, just to demonstrate how we actually allow only certain ping traffic and SQL traffic and SSH traffic between the applications. And like in the past, you will see all the relevant information now in the context of the zone. This is important again. You will see it in the context of the tenant zone for all the different parameters, both in the traffic logs and the threat logs, and on the firewall side. So that's the the first use case that we're supporting with multi-tenancy. So let's keep moving on. There is a lot of material to cover. So the next use case is the hosting or MSSP use case that I was referring to, where you actually have now the capability to have separate policy sets, separate images, separate licenses. And the way this works is, in this case, if you have two customers on a hosting environment, say one is Honda and the other is Toyota, you now have a capability to have different policy sets for each of them, and you will create this again in Panorama, and you will push that to the NSX manager. so that when you actually do the installation on your ESXi clusters, you have a capability to use the relevant service definition. And again, in terms of scale, we can support up to 32 service definition, which essentially means if a hosting provider had up to 32 different customers in his VMware environment, he could support them with different policy sets. So we'll have a quick demo of that next. So this is the key configuration that you need to be aware of. So in the past, you had a default service definition. Now here, we are actually creating one service definition per customer. And those are the three key attributes. I'm not sure if it's visible at the back, but essentially the device group where all the policies are residing, the templates where all the zones and network configurations are residing, as well as the OVFs, everything can be different per customer. So that's how you set it up initially from the VMware Service Manager in Panorama. And this is the other aspect to keep in mind is the templates and device groups, right? As these firewalls are now being spun up on different ESXi clusters, they're attaching to Panorama with the relevant context for different templates and device groups where the configurations will reside. So in this particular case, if BMW and Toyota were the two customers, then you see that they are attaching into the right template on the Panorama side and inheriting the relevant policies. And similarly, on the NSX Manager side, if you look at the installation tab, then here is where you see all these different service definitions, right? So the key attribute has been, this is all automated. You just do your configuration within Panorama. That's where all of your security configurations are happening, and you're just deploying it within NSX Manager. So here you pick the relevant ESXi clusters. You will see the DHCP option, which is, again, a new introduction 7.1. And you are now able to roll out different services for different clusters, and then the relevant VMSeries will be spun up with the right attributes on each of those clusters. So those are the two primary use cases for multi-tenancy in 7.1. The additional use case, which I briefly alluded to earlier, is actually when you combine both of these and you actually roll out the different service definitions on a single ESXi cluster, you now have a capability to have multiple VMSeries spun up on the same ESXi host, right? So in case your performance requirements are higher or you need the resource and policy isolation for different tenants on a shared infrastructure, you can now support that in 7.1. And a typical configuration, because obviously there is the footprint requirement on each VMSeries, so customers who have larger deployments and who also have more hardware resources on their compute infrastructure can typically leverage this functionality. So in summary, in multi-tenancy in 7.1, you're actually moving from a single service definition, single set of policies to multiple service definitions to enable some of the use cases that I alluded to earlier. And second, and more importantly, you now have a capability to have policy separation, traffic separation for tenant traffic on a shared infrastructure within Panorama and NSX Manager. So that was with regards to NSX. Next, we'll quickly look at Cisco ACI, right? So obviously, there are differences in the way each of these architectures work, and I will not cover that in detail. I'm sure a lot of you guys have looked at some of those differences. But the way we operate in this environment, so if you look at Cisco ACI, it's primarily built around ACI fabric, which constitutes top of rack and spines from Cisco. And if you again look at how the different application tiers are built, in case of ACI, they are built using endpoint groups. Now, the way you actually include servers, VMs, or in case of ACI, you can also include physical servers into endpoint groups is different. On the NSX side, it's mainly based on VM attributes. In case of ACI, it's mainly using networking attributes today, right? But essentially, from our standpoint, from Palo Alto Networks, we have a device package for ACI, which leverages all of our APIs to configure our firewalls automatically when they are inserted into this data center fabric. So if you look at it, and the way the service insertion or the traffic redirection happens in case of ACI is by using a combination of contracts and service graphs, right? So in this particular case, you're building all your web, app, and DB EPGs, and using the service graph, you are indicating which EPG traffic needs to be sent to the Palo Alto Networks firewall for the security inspection. Do keep in mind that in case of ACI, there is no auto-instantiation of the firewalls. So you need to do the pre-provisioning for licenses and other basic configuration and make sure that they're connected to the ACI fabric, right? Because it's mainly based on physical infrastructure. And the other key aspect is that both physical as well as VMSeries firewalls can be supported in an ACI fabric because it's agnostic to ACI, whether you're attaching a physical device or a VMSeries device. So this is how the flow works, as in once you've done all the setup using the device package, which essentially is a bunch of Python scripts, which leverages our rich APIs to configure these VMSeries firewalls. They are now inserted in the path of traffic, and they can inspect all the traffic which is going between these EPGs. And all of the configuration here is essentially using layer 3. We still have the Panorama integration, right? So that's a key point to note, that in the device package, the way we've structured, the way the devices come up and connect, they automatically connect to Panorama. And the configuration push that we looked at even in case of NSX with the device groups and templates are still available here. Once the firewalls connect to Panorama, they connect to the relevant device group where all the ACI devices have the relevant configurations. They then get the policies from there. So this is how a service chaining infrastructure looks like on ACI, wherein, again, based on different endpoint groups, for the web tier to app tier, you might say you want to have a service chain which includes a Palo Alto Network service and then has a particular load balancer in the path, right? Or the other way around. So you essentially can now include multiple services using our device package on ACI. The last key part I want to cover was with regards to the generic 7.1 functionality that we're introducing on VMSeries. So this will be available on all hypervisors, ESXi, KVM, Hyper-V. And the one key attribute is bootstrapping, right? So in your virtual environments, when you spin up your VMSeries firewalls, you want them to be pre-provisioned, right? You want to have, okay, I see a lot of nods, so that's a good thing. So you want to make sure that they have the relevant configurations, they have the relevant licenses, they have even software updates, right? A lot of customers like to start with 7.1.5 or because there is a lot of stability in those releases. So we now allow you to actually have all of this information within the Bootstrap package, which essentially means that once you attach the Bootstrap ISO to a VMSeries firewall, it'll boot up for the first boot with all of these relevant parameters and come fully provisioned when it's inserted in the path of traffic, right? So a lot of these capabilities were available with NSX in the past. Now you will have this available on all platforms, and we'll also talk about that in the context of public cloud in the next presentation, right? So that's one key attribute or key functionality that we're introducing in 7.1. The other is around visibility. So I spoke about some of that earlier. So we support both the OpenVM tools as well as Linux integration services for the ESXi and Hyper-V environments, which gives you, again, more visibility into the VM operations. This is essentially for your VI or virtual infrastructure admin so that you can look at attributes on the firewall side, right? In the past, they could not. Now you can actually look at your SCVMM or vCenter environment and look at how much resources are being utilized. You can look at the heartbeats. You can do graceful shutdown from vCenter. And you actually give the VI administrator all these capabilities if he were to, say, shut down a bunch of VMs on a particular ESXi host. He can now do it on that console itself, do it gracefully. And the other support is obviously around HA. Right? So there's a heartbeat mechanism going between the VMSeries firewalls and vCenter, which actually allows to check for all the different HA attributes within VMware as well as Microsoft environments. The third is the offline licensing. Right? So if your Panorama doesn't have internet access, if the firewalls don't have internet access, in the VM deployments, customers obviously expect that you can deploy them both in online and offline scenarios. So we're now adding support for that. One key point to note, as in case of ESXi, KVM, and Hyper-V, you can use the Bootstrap functionality and put the license keys in there for actually supporting the offline scenarios. In case of NSX, you'll have to use the firewall APIs and the APIs on the license server to provision the licenses once the VMs are spun up, because there the Bootstrap actually is built from the NSX infrastructure side. So that's why there's a slight difference in both scenarios. And the last is DHCP support and management. So we'll end with quickly looking at the Bootstrap. So as I said earlier, you have the config, the software images, content, license, all of that available per firewall, and you create that in the Bootstrap ISO. And so these are some of the key attributes in the init configuration file, right? So this will tell the firewall which Panorama to connect to, what is the management IP, the DHCP information, the DNS information, and a bunch of other key configurations which are needed for the firewall to come up. And if you look at the second attribute, that's the bootstrap.xml. So once a firewall is up, now if you had multiple firewalls and you know that they need identical configuration, then you can take that bootstrap.xml and put it in there. So once the firewall comes up with the initial configuration, that's the second configuration which will be applied. And once it connects to Panorama, the relevant configuration, the device groups and templates will also be applied, right? So there's complete automation on per firewall basis or from Panorama. So we'll quickly look at a workflow for bootstrapping for the online case. So in this case, obviously, you have internet connectivity. So you will use the auth code mechanism for licensing. You set up your initial Bootstrap container with the content config and all of the other data. And you can use an orchestrator such as Chef, Puppet, OpenStack, and actually attach these Bootstrap containers to that VMSeries. And then when the VMSeries gets that Bootstrap information, it'll come up, apply the software, do the initial configuration, and then be able to connect to the license server using the auth code which is specified in the Bootstrap. And then the license keys are actually automatically downloaded from the license server. So once that happens, you actually get the content update. So again, all of this is pre-provisioned in the Bootstrap container. So this is basically a workflow that we've developed in the software. So it then gets the content update, applies the configuration, and then eventually connects to Panorama. So that's how the workflow will look like with bootstrapping in these environments. The second use case here is obviously around the no internet access case, right? So your firewalls and Panorama both don't connect to the internet. And in this scenario, you use the UUID, CPUID as in the past, and using the auth code, you get an individual license key from the license server, and you then put that into the Bootstrap container, right? So far as the Bootstrap container either sees the auth code for online case or the individual license keys for offline case, it will be able to license the firewall automatically, right? So the rest of the steps are the same. So once the Bootstrap has the relevant license keys, it will then go through the same steps, and the firewall will be fully provisioned once it comes up. So that's what I had in terms of content. So the key takeaways here again is that, as we heard yesterday in the keynote, we are marching towards securing all the major clouds in public and private cloud areas, and we'll look at the enhancements in public cloud next. On the private cloud, with the key VMware NSX integration, we are now adding support for multi-tenancy, multiple policy sets being able to deploy VMseries with different configurations being inherited depending on where the deployment is happening. And the third is essentially the automation that you now get with Bootstrap for provisioning your firewalls automatically, again, regardless of which environment you're spinning them up in, whether it's ESXi, KVM, Hyper-V, OpenStack, or the public cloud environments. So that's all I had in terms of content. We actually have, in the demo expo area, we have a lot of these being demonstrated, so please feel free to stop by there in the course of the day. And I would like to open it up for questions at this point. Yeah.
Could you speak a little bit more about the HA environment?
Sure. So the question was about high availability. So just to be clear, so in 7.0, we've added support for HA. So you have the HA1, HA2, HA3 for the config and session sync. So that capability is available on all the hypervisor platforms, ESXi, KVM, and Hyper-V. For NSX, because there is one VMseries per host, the HA model is slightly different. It uses the fail open, fail close, and other attributes from VMware, because if you had vMotion, if a particular host or a VM were down, then the firewalls on the other host will be able to protect that traffic. So for the native or the standalone hypervisor environments, the HA has all the capabilities for HA1, HA2, HA3. Any other questions? Yeah, please.
If you vMotion a virtual firewall, what kind of hit do you get? So let's say you're not HA. You got a single virtual firewall. You got like IPsec termination on there. What kind of hit do you get?
So are you talking about vMotion of the firewalls or vMotion of
vMotion of the firewall.
So as of now, we don't support vMotion of the firewalls. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, thanks a lot for your time. And again, I look forward to chatting with each of you guys, or if you have any other questions, I'll be around, or I'll be in the booth later in the day. Thanks for your time.